Well, I think the current situation in Ukraine now, you can see three possible scenarios. Two that I think are less likely. That would be Minsk II gets implemented. I would like to see Minsk II be implemented, but it's a pretty complex agreement, and I'm not sure that you have goodwill, particularly on the side of the separatists and the Russians. The second scenario would be a resumption of major fighting, but at this point in time, it looks like both the Ukrainians and the Russians don't want to see that happen, so that's good news. But until you have a real settlement, there's a risk that that fighting could start even inadvertently. So it brings us to the third scenario, which unfortunately I think is the most likely one looking out over the near to midterm, and that is you have in the occupied part of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass, the emergence of a new frozen or not so frozen conflict. And it applies because that allows the Russians, who I believe the Russians, they don't want Donbass, but they see that as a means to put pressure on the government in Kyiv to destabilize the government. And as a frozen conflict, they can ratchet it up and down. And on the Ukrainian side, I think at one point, they don't want to take economic responsibility for Donbass until they can reassert political sovereignty. So both sides may now be in a situation where Donbass is sort of a frozen conflict, unfortunately.
Okay.
There may be something of an attempt to change the subject by the Russian military action in Syria. But I think there are also some very specific Syria reasons. One is the Russians do want to bolster the Assad regime. Mm-hmm. And you see that in their military action. Even though in Moscow they say the target, the focus of their military action is the Islamic State, they're dropping very few bombs on Islamic State. They're hitting those groups that pose the most immediate threat to Assad and his government. And unfortunately, they're hitting moderate groups. Now I use the term moderate in Syria in relative terms. But some of the people that the Russians are now bombing would have to be involved in a political transition. So what the Russians are doing, unfortunately, may make a political settlement in Syria more difficult. So that's one part. Another part is, again, Putin's part of his appeal now to the Russian people is it's nationalism, and you've seen that since 2012. It's Russia's now back as a player on the world stage. So it's showing we're a big player, we can do major things. And that's part of it too. And part of it again gets back to domestic politics, in that from 2000 to 2008, Putin's selling point to the Russian people was, I'm improving the economy, your living standards are growing. And he delivered. I think since 2012, when he came back to the presidency, he saw the economic situation was much more difficult, and he switched the narrative now to one of nationalism, Russia back as a great power, and Syria then feeds into that narrative. There are a couple times where I think actually Putin deserved it. When President Obama made the comment, Putin sits there slouches like a lazy schoolboy, and he got criticized for that. And I actually thought, well, I'm actually glad he said that, because President Putin's very calculating. When President Putin slouched like a lazy schoolboy, he was doing that to send a message, and I think it was a message of disrespect to Obama. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Obama calls him out on that, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I think calling Russia a regional power, that plays badly in Moscow, and the Russians may be pushing back to show some things on that one. And it gets back to, I think, this question of Russia's desire, Putin's desire, the Kremlin's desire for respect for Russia. I think at one level, Obama understands that. But the question is, Russia will have respect and engagement if Russia plays by international norms and rules. And that's why I believe U.S.-Russia relations have fallen to their lowest point in the last 25 years, is because the invasion or the military seizure of Crimea, military action in eastern Ukraine, it was so egregious in terms of violating what was seen as the European security order, the main rule of which was you don't use military force to change borders. And so Russia can have respect, but it's going to have more respect when it plays by the rules, and that's one of the problems it has now. On some things, I think we are. I think there's no daylight between Washington and Europe on the question that Minsk II, which has flaws, it's the only settlement agreement on the table, so the pressure is to keep both sides to try to implement that. There's no difference there. The sides, I think, have similar views in terms of providing assistance to Ukraine, financial assistance, but also tying that and saying that the price of that insistence is that Ukraine do serious economic reform, and we should be doing that. We need to push Ukraine to do reform as much as possible. There are different perspectives on military assistance. I think in Europe that's questioned. The United States is doing a couple things now. One, it's training Ukrainian soldiers, although the training is taking place in Yavoriv. Yavoriv is as far west as you can be in Ukraine and still be in Ukraine. Any further west, they would be in Poland. So it's well away from the military action. There's also provision of non-lethal assistance, which I support. And again, I think that's not fully supported in Europe. And then there's the more difficult question in which there's not a single view in Washington, in which I disagree with the president. I would argue that there are at least one kind of lethal military assistance, light anti-armor weapons, that we should provide to offset the advantages that they have on the Russian separatist side because of a large influx of Russian armor. That was debated back in the United States back in February, March. The president, I think, chose the cautious route. I think he was overly cautious here. And my guess is that will remain the policy as long as things are quiet in the East. But if you were to see a major upsurge in fighting, then that debate becomes a very live one in Washington, and there would be a lot of pressure on the White House, both from Republicans and Democrats, to change the policy and provide some weapons as well as non-lethal military assistance.
Okay.
I actually think that the Chancellor's played a very positive role, in part because I see her position as one in principle, that it's, and she understands that there are business consequences to economic sanctions, but I think she's also committed to the principle that you shouldn't change borders in Europe by force. And my impression in Washington is very comfortable with Chancellor Merkel. And if we could go back to February 2014, and if I could describe to colleagues at Brookings where the United States and Europe would be in October of 2015 in terms of the sanctions and the pressure on Russia, I think people would have been surprised. And I think Chancellor Merkel deserves a lot of credit for that. And it's important, and I hope that the United States and Europe can continue to stay on the same page. You know, the Chancellor says that sanctions should stay on, they should not be eased until Minsk II is fully implemented. I hope we can hold to that position because I think that does still have a chance of changing the political calculation in Moscow. Certainly to date, the economic sanctions, there's no doubt they've had an economic impact. They haven't yet changed Russian political policy. And that's the objective, is to get the Russians basically to back away from military means and really commit to full implementation of the Minsk agreement.